We are talking about what the Bible can help us on our mental health issues, and particularly on this child with wounds. And we're going to talk about Joseph today. You know, this section of Genesis is like most of the Bible. It's a narrative, it's a story. It's not presented as a set of principles or a list of rules. It's presented as a story. And I think if we let it truly draw us in, if we let this story impact us the way I think God has intended it, I think this, as much as any story other than that of Jesus himself, has the power to change us. And to change our outlook when things happen that are very bad to us. And help us not just ask, why did God inflict this on me? But to trust in him that he knows what he's doing. And he can take the worst decisions of humans and turn them into great things. And we may never see that. We'll talk about that today. One thing I want to talk about, well, I hope we don't wear out this, but you know, we try to emphasize there are clinical diagnoses that meet certain criteria, that the things we've been talking about, what trauma, depression, anxiety, you can put with capital letters, a capital T, trauma. And one of the things that we noted, and Phil talked about this some, is that, well, we use the same words sometimes, and you'll see it online and conversations, to talk about something that's not past that principle, maybe well short of that, and that probably, rather than using that word, using words like wounds or hurts or discouragement or worry might be better, so we don't get in the habit of, as the term goes, inflating our wounds, inflating our anxiety, inflating our discouragement. And like I mentioned that night, Phil was talking about this. This isn't just a problem on the internet with celebrities and others. Even some professionals, medical professionals, fall into this trap of, I think, maybe not intending to, but sort of encouraging people to inflate their feelings, make them worse than they are. But on the other hand, there's another trap that you can fall into by making the distinction so stark and treating capital T or capital D depression as something so different that we encourage people that are over here to think, well, nobody knows about this. Nobody can relate to me. And I think that's bad too, that these things aren't related, as we noted, that they may be longer lasting, they may be more frequent, the feelings may be more intense, they may affect our lives more, but people over here that are suffering wounds, the feelings are pretty much the same thing. And I say this not just hypothetically. Years ago, a person who suffered from depression made this statement. He goes, you know, when people talk about discouragement, and he goes, look, that has nothing to do with what I suffer. And I thought, over the years, that stuck with me because I thought, that's not right. And that is only a means Satan has to try to isolate us and make us think that, oh, nobody gets it. The other thing that could happen is that if we're over here, we can think, well, what's going on with people that are suffering this can't really help. That's something totally different. So, again, let's not push ourselves to be worse than we are. Let's keep our wounds and discouragement in perspective. But wherever we are on here, recognizing, I think, that the Bible has some help to provide to us. All right. So, we're in the story of Joseph. Not everyone here may know this story well. I suspect most do. But just in case I'm going to cover some things very quickly. The beginning of the story in Genesis 37, that when Israel, or Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in an old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him, Joseph, more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. You know, somebody pointed out in this, well, I think it was very insightful, the hidden depths of sin and the hidden depths of bad decisions that may not reach the level of sin. This is the good version of Jacob. This isn't the younger Jacob making silly and evil, bad decisions. This is the kind of a post, kind of epiphany Jacob, if you will. And yet he makes an incredibly foolish and maybe even sinful decision to elevate Joseph to an idol. Why would he do this?
He's Rachel's.
He's Rachel's son. Rachel had this special place in his heart. She dies after the birth of Benjamin, and so he elevates Joseph to take Rachel's place, more or less. And it poisons his family. It's in many ways it's Jacob that sets up the trouble that emerges here. But it isn't just Jacob. That Joseph, what happens when we're privileged and overprivileged? I have resisted this idea, and Julie's had to live with me. Why are they saying that? The Bible doesn't say that. The idea that, Joseph is bratty, he's spoiled, he's acting badly. And I think, in reading up and studying more on this, I do think, where it expresses, well, he gave a bad report on the sons of Zilpah and the other one, Bildad. And they said, well, yeah, the bad report that means false report. If you really dig into that, that's not obvious. Yeah, it may have been he was giving a truth report. But I think if you read on down, the thing that speaks more to Joseph's problem is the dream. Who gave Joseph this dream? God. There's two dreams, I should say. God did. What did Joseph do with it? He told it. Did he have to tell it? Did he have to tell it to his brothers? No, you think, okay, he's just young. He's 17. He's not 5. A 5-year-old, you could say, well, okay, there's whatever comes to their head they're saying. At best, Joseph is very naive. And at worst, prideful and arrogant, and using this as a means of saying, hey, you see, because they could see, he could see, you didn't have to have some great insight to figure out what the 11 sheep of bowing down to Joseph and the sun and the moon and the stars bowing down to Joseph, what the meaning of that is. They all, his brothers and his father, immediately got that image. And so I do think there's a case to be made that Joseph really had turned into this very entitled and overprivileged and not so humble son, who then is sold by his brothers into slavery. He's raised up to become the favorite servant of a very important person, captain of the captain of the guard of Pharaoh's palace. Potiphar was an important person. But then he's also accused of trying to rape Potiphar's wife. In fact, she was the one trying to lure him in. He's thrown into prison. And again, it's interesting. Hard to know. It says Potiphar was angry, but it doesn't designate exactly who he was angry at. What indicates that he probably wasn't totally sold on his wife's story? Right. I mean, if he really thought Joseph did this, he had the power to just end his life. The fact that he put him in prison, he had to save face. He could, the family as a whole, that looks bad if you say, okay, well, I'm elevating my servant or my wife. And so, but he puts him in prison. There he interprets the dream of another, some ways even more official, two officials, the baker, the head baker, and then this cupbearer, a person who's entrusted with the very live Pharaoh's life, who has direct access to Pharaoh. But then he's forgotten. And then he has this opportunity because of the cupbearer finally remembering and raising him up his name to Pharaoh. He interprets Pharaoh's dream. He's made prime minister of Egypt. He helped save Egypt. And he's reunited with his brothers, his family, and he saves the whole of Egypt. Right? So, let me ask you, in that story, what are some of the instances? Put yourself as much as we can. This is what in-class practice. What are the deep wounds inflicted on Joseph? Under what circumstances is he feeling just, I'm being ripped apart?
Your brothers selling you.
Yeah. First, they throw you in this pit. Yeah, there's a 1990s miniseries that was pretty well done, as a low-budget miniseries could be, but they throw him in the pit. There's a snake in the pit. Our daughter Bear was little. Why'd you a snake in there? But it did raise sort of the factor. But yeah, his brothers throw him in this pit, and then they sell him to slave traders. That had, can you imagine going from being the favorite son to now you're on this trip to Egypt, and I doubt being treated real gently. That, you're talking about night and day difference in existence. Then, yeah, first he's thrown into prison because of the lies of Potiphar's wife. And he ends up being thrown in there, and then he helps Pharaoh's official, and then he's forgotten again. And I want to speak to this. The Lord spoke the other night, and I think did a good job of noting that, look, our wounds sometimes are self-inflicted. The sins and bad decisions we make come back on us. Sometimes it's other people and what they do. Sometimes it's, sort of the world and what's going on and that impacts us. Sometimes it's what we see others doing to others. There are people in this audience that what they've experienced as being seeing the wounds that get inflicted between people and in the world. But I think one of the wounds that can be the deepest, and we talked about this a bit on discouragement, when you're trying to do the right thing and it turns out horribly wrong, that is wounding. And I think it hits someone very deeply. Can you imagine Joseph? Here, he's raised up in Potiphar's house thinking, hey, the Lord is helping me. He's with me. I've resisted her temptations. I've done the right thing. And now I'm in prison for that. That had to be incredibly hurtful. And then when Pharaoh's official, hey, in fact, he says in the story, don't forget me. Don't remember me. And then years go by, a couple of years, and nothing. And so in this story, we're not talking about bruises and scrapes. Somebody's not just getting us. As we've noted here, I think there's a lot of analogy that can be drawn between physical wounds and physical illness and mental problems. These aren't the little scrapes. These are fractured bones. These are deep cuts. Well, then we come down, so all of those things happen. And then the culmination of the story, as the brothers have come down to Egypt, and then they go back and they bring back Benjamin, and there's some back and forth with this cup that Joseph had hidden in Benjamin's sack, and Judah is willing to stay in place of Benjamin. It says, then Joseph could no longer control himself for all his attendants. And he cried out, have everyone leave my presence, so that there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified in his presence. Then he drew his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept. And Benjamin embraced him, weeping. And he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. Afterward, his brothers talked with him. Why such an emotional release here? What does that speak to? What does that indicate in this story?
All the wounds have come to fruition.
I think one, the deepness of the wounds, coming back up years, 13 years plus now, of this buildup in combination with what? Forgiveness. A combination of seeing and sensing that he had been placed in this position for a reason. All of that combining together to just overwhelm him. It's one of the stories, I don't know, we're going over this quickly, and it doesn't have maybe the full impact that it would if we had time to read it all. But I think this is why God didn't just write a bunch of, here's principles you need to live by. This is intended, yes, to impact what we think, but it's intended to impact how we feel about God and how we feel about it. Because if you try to battle emotional hurts with purely intellectual ideas, how does that? Right, it may have some impact, but you got, to some extent, you got to go up against emotional hurts with emotional remedies. And the Bible is full of emotion and feeling. And that's, I think, the nature of why it's written as narrative. There's very little of it that's written like the book of Leviticus. And yet, in fact, when we hear the term the law in the Psalms, it's not referring just to Leviticus. It's referring to these narratives that David and the other psalmists are calling God's law, his story. All right.
Right.
Yes.
One of the things that I like about the story about Joseph is you can see that he is very human, and he does play a little mind game with his brothers, with the cup and wanting to keep Benjamin, and when he could have revealed it earlier and said, "Hey, go get Dad," he didn't. There's a little.
Yeah,
to me,
I'm going to come back to that. One of the things of this, there's so many things we talk about, and second, trying to figure out how best to work things in. But let's hold on to that for a minute, and I'm going to come back to it. So, what I want to mainly focus on here is letting Joseph speak to us about his wounds and about our wounds. He says more or less the same things in chapter 45, but here in chapter 50, this is at Jacob's deathbed, and Jacob has just pronounced blessings and to some extent curses on his sons in chapter 49. And now Jacob dies, and what's the feeling of his brothers?
You're going to kill us.
Yeah, you're going to kill us. You can't hurt. Dad said, don't hurt us, right? And here is, Joseph gives a reply that's longer than what I give here, but this really speaks to the essence of it. And I mentioned a while back, Derek Kidner, kind of a well-known commentator from the 20th century, he wrote, there's this story, and Jacob's, as he called it, threefold response expresses the message of faith of both the Old and New Testament, maybe better than any other story. And I think it's really powerful. First, he says, to their fear of him harming and getting retribution, he says, am I in the place of God? You know, think about that. Speaking to himself, speaking to us, no matter how deep the wound may be. What's he saying? Who's he putting this in the hand of? Let God handle it. You know, as the Hebrew writers, you know, vengeance is mine, says the Lord. Let him repay. I think there's a strong message. Well, let me ask this. What is Satan's first appeal to Adam and particularly Eve?
You want to be like God?
You want to be like God. Putting yourself in, you eat this, you'll become like God. Well, did they? Well, no. Who really has the moral authority and the wisdom and the power to deal with evil in just the right way? God. Now, look, God has granted us as parents, and he's granted civil government certain authority to act in his place, imperfectly, obviously. But in terms of really dealing in the right way, God is the way one can do it. And yet, kind of a corollary to this is when we seek vengeance on others, we try to figure out how we can stick it to somebody. Sometimes maybe even our spouse when we feel like they've hurt us. We're putting a lot of moral authority in ourselves. Or if we trust in a friend or even a therapist. Or maybe we come to trust in our era, our culture to tell us what the moral authority is. There's only one true moral authority. And that's what Joseph's coming back here. He's not saying, well, you know, it's no big deal. This was a big deal. Yes, you deserve to be punished. But he goes, am I in the place of God? Am I going to take on the authority of God? And I think that's something that we've got to really rein ourselves in some. Second, he says, and I think this is really at the heart of our message today. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. There's nothing in this story that would suggest that God made his brothers put him in the pit, or made Aaron or Potiphar's wife lie and try to tempt him. But what's the message of this story in terms of those evil acts?
Evil's no match for God's plan.
Yeah. God can take evil and make it work for his ends. Think about it. One commentator talks about, as we talk about the hidden depths of sin at the beginning of the story, the hidden purposes of God. That Joseph, yes, by the end of the story, he begins kind of getting a picture of, but as this is developing, he would have had no clue. But as we see it unfold, what are God's hidden purposes here? What is God accomplishing along the way? Well, ultimately saving Jacob's family, but that's sort of the end result, but the intermediate steps. In order to do that, now God can obviously save people lots of various ways, but in the way this works out, what are the purposes of him being, how does God ultimately use him being thrown in this pit and sold to the Ishmaelites?
He's got to get him in a position of authority.
Right. He's got to get him to Egypt Then he gets into Egypt, but just being Potiphar's favorite servant is not going to get him a conversation with Pharaoh. And so God uses the evil of Potiphar's wife to put him in a position to talk to Pharaoh's cupbearer, who can get him a conversation. Now, it takes a couple of years. But ultimately, those 2 years make all the difference because he gets a direct conversation with the most powerful person in maybe the entire world. You know, and even other things that aren't evil decisions in this story. Remember that as this develops, Jacob sends him to go looking for his brothers. How does he find them? Well, he comes across this guy in Dothan, where Jacob had sent them, and the guy says, or Shechem, I'm getting mixed up here, comes across him, and this guy that had run into his brothers runs into Joseph. And he says, hey, they went on up to Dothan. Again, God is both through just normal decisions and actions of everyday people, as well as the evil and sinful decisions of people. He's working this toward his ends. Think about it. We often use this passage, Romans 8. You know, all things work together for those that love the Lord. And I think sometimes we have in mind that, okay, yeah, this will happen, and a week later, I'm going to see, that worked out, or a year later. Is that what Romans 8 is saying? No, I think Romans 8, I think the story of Joseph is a good illustration of what Romans 8 is saying. Because by the end of the story, what could Joseph now see? Well,
saw God's plan.
Yeah, he could see God's plan. I was put here, and by Joseph being put there, what was he able to do?
In the story, it actually says it was meant for good, bring about it that many people should be kept alive.
Yeah. So who ultimately is kept alive?
The seed of Abraham.
Right. Jacob and his family, the descendants of Abraham. Who else? The whole nation of Egypt is saved. And so you see this expansive effect. But even then, even standing at the end of this and looking back, what is it that Joseph cannot have any idea about? Of what his life and God's working out through this, the impacts that's going to have. Again,
It leads to Christ.
yes. Through a long series of events. Through the next Pharaoh, or a Pharaoh later, not knowing who Joseph was. Enslaving this growing nation. And so getting Jacob's family there, Egypt becomes an incubator. They expand in ways that likely they would not have expanded living in Canaan. They move into this very fertile area. They're very prosperous, very fertile families. And then they're enslaved. Then their enslavement turns into deliverance in this whole history of Israel. Joseph could see none of that. And yet his story is integral to that. Look, we can never see, even in a moment in time, all of the sort of ripple effects cracks may have over the next day or two. But what we definitely cannot see are intergenerational impacts. What impact is this going to have 100 years from now? Well, one of the commentators on this noted, he said, my great-great-grandfather made the decision to, and I can't ever put it all together, but he made this decision, and that led to this, and that led to me being here, and then he goes, I'm standing here today, he's saying, because of something like great-great-grandfather. None of us can have any sense of that.
Brian,
Yes.
Frank's been trying to make a comment.
Now,
I knew that, I was just ignoring it. Thanks.
now, I just wanted to share, I think, a powerful example when I was over in Uganda, that there was a preacher there that had been on Uganda's death row. He was falsely accused of a murder, and I don't remember if it was an accidental misidentification or someone maliciously identified him. But anyway, he was on death row, and some preachers came from the Church of Christ, had a Bible study. He wanted to be baptized. The prison would not allow him to be baptized, so he was praying that God would help him get out of prison. And on the day he was to be hung, the judge reviewed his case and released him. The second case in Ugandan history of someone being released from death row. And as he got out, he said that God sent him to jail so he could be saved. And so we bought him Bibles, so he's distributed those Bibles. He's preaching in eastern Uganda. His name is Samuel Kunya.
That's a very good story. Yeah, think about it. What if Reuben shows up a little early? Reuben was going to pull Joseph out of the pit. God worked it so that he got sold before that happened. What if Potiphar's wife had been a more virtuous person? All of those are things God uses. God uses good things and good people, but God's bigger than badness and evil, and He can use it.
And kind of like what we're alluding to is how this helps with our prayer life, and we can imagine what Joseph prayed for in the midst of this, not seeing the things that you're describing, the end result of saving Egypt and his family, and then generationally. And I heard a quote recently from Tim Keller that I don't know if I haven't worked it all out in my head yet, but the quote was, when we pray, maybe God gives us what we would have asked for if we knew what he knew.
Yeah. That's, I think, in some ways the essence of Romans 8, and the Spirit helping our prayers and saying things, taking what we're saying and making better use and sense of them. But another aspect of this, besides his family, how does this help to save Joseph?
He's humble. I think if there is pride in the beginning of the story, which, that's how I read it, the interaction that he has with his brothers at the end of the story could not have happened if his heart had not been changed through this.
Right. Think about it. That Joseph we see at the end here seems to be very different than the 17-year-old kind of overprivileged favorite son. That God changes him through the wounds. And I think that's an important thing that now often we cannot. It's hard for us to buy into because none of us want pain. It's natural as humans to. We think, in fact, there's something wrong with us if we're seeking out pain. But that doesn't mean pain isn't helpful and can't help us. And then he ends with, what? We've been talking about those things. Next one. Then lastly it says, so that don't be afraid, I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Again, here is Joseph extending not just an intellectual goodwill or forgiveness to them, but genuine kindness. Where does that come from? Is it because Joseph, like I said, is Joseph now saying, it was no big deal?
When you think about Joseph and how he was talking to his brothers, it was about him. When you look at even the story of Potiphar's seeing now that Joseph's God was with him, because that's why he had him where he had him, to do those things. And Joseph had realized it's not about me, it's about God.
Yeah, that's In fact, now, Joseph has this, he's living in the grace of God. He's feeling it, he's recognizing it.
So if you look at that, and then you look at the end, where he's talking to his brothers, you know he's been humbled. You know, many times we think it's about us and how good we are. And Joseph realized it's not about me.
Yeah.
Even when he was serving Potiphar, the one thing I was told that I should not do or could not have was your wife. And that's why he was put in prison, because he wouldn't.
So, let me ask you, how is it he's able to extend such grace and kindness to the very people who hurt him so badly?
That's God.
Because he's now living in the grace of God. I think there's a huge message to us here. If we're going to extend grace and kindness, we have to be in the grace of God. And if we are in God's grace, a sign of that is we should be willing and ready to extend grace and kindness.
I think you think about it, him being 17 and being prideful and kind of puffing out his chest, like, it was very validating for him, for them to kind of be like, oh my word, like, we're so sorry, like, kind of the repercussions didn't really, they were kind of a lot for him walking around being so puffed up. Not that it was right, but for them coming to him and being like, I mean, they're falling on their face, being like, we are their slaves. Like, it's very, I'm sure he questioned himself a lot. Like, wow, is that, like, did the punishment really fit the crime that much? Yes, it was great for God's good, but it was probably very validating for him to be like, okay, it's kind of come full circle, and this is a loving relationship.
Right. Well, in fact, in this, in many ways, he does, I think, what God does with us. The story of the cup and all seems to be a way of, one, testing their faithfulness. Are you, should you be trusted? But also encouraging their faithfulness. It's because of that draws out Judah's willingness to put himself in the place of Benjamin. And so, again, it's sort of an interesting aspect of the story.
It's interesting when Joseph and his brothers started out in the same household with the same environmental circumstances and probably thought largely the same, but there's a very noticeable contrast by the end of the story between Joseph's behavior and his brother's behavior, and it becomes apparent when Jacob dies, and then they think that he still thinks like them. It's like, oh, he's going to get us now, we're really in trouble, It's like they can't understand that he's gone through a transformation they haven't undergone, and it's very noticeable by then. It's like he would have thought like them if he hadn't gone through all of those things.
Exactly. And so then this story, the word typology is sometimes used, I don't think, incorrectly. And obviously this is a foreshadowing, but sometimes I think people that really get into it, the typology almost becomes like, where's Waldo, or the hidden Mickey was mine. This is different than the typology we see in the law, in that, these cups represent this. This, I would call more of a repetition of the way God works. Over and over again, God takes the weak things and makes them strong. He takes the strong things and makes them weak. He saves in ways that we would never imagine. His grace is worked out through our weakness and our sin, not by making us do it, by working through it. Well, that's the story of Jesus, and we're running out of time here. And there are many other parallels I think we could find. It's interesting, Joseph's name is never mentioned as sort of a foreshadower of Jesus in the New Testament, but I don't know of any story in the Old Testament that parallels the story of Jesus any more closely. In fact, one series on this refers to the gospel according to Joseph. And it's a powerful message. So Jacob at the end of his life says this about Joseph: he's a fruitful vine, your spring, with branches climb over the wall. With bitterness, archers attacked him. They shot at him with hostility, but his bow remained steady. His strong arm stayed the limber because of the hand of the mighty one of Jacob, because of the shepherd, the rock of Israel, because of your father's God who helps you, because of the Almighty who blesses you. He's saying this, it got us going up for voicing. He's saying this not just to Joseph, but to Joseph's brothers. It's a message of you can trust in God. When you may never see the end of it. It may turn out terribly. You may stay in prison. You may not get that final last ever reprieve. Does that mean God isn't working? That's the message. That's why we have stories like Joseph. Not that, oh, it's all going to work out like great like it did for Joseph. The story is God is working. And we are not going to see it. In fact, Joseph in many ways is privileged to be able to see as much of how it works out as he does. But we have the story of Joseph. We have the story of Jesus. Those stories tell us God is working even when it looks like all we're doing is suffering. But he's actually taking our suffering and changing us and changing the world through it. Well, here's our out-of-class challenge. I went back and forth. I wanted to use some aspect of Joseph's story. It was my best attempt at it. So think for a minute. Think for a little bit on each of these. And if you were sitting with Jacob or Joseph in these situations, what would you ask him? And what would his response be of his sense of God working when he was at 17 and Jacob's favorite son? When he was in prison after Potiphar's wife falsely accused him? When he's with his brothers at Jacob's deathbed? And now, if you could interview him now, looking back on the history of Israel after him, and then praying these things after you've thought through this interview with Joseph. Lord, you work in ways I cannot see, but I believe that you are working in my life, even in the wounds. Lord, the wounds that have and will come in my life are painful, but I believe that you will use them to save me and to save others. Lord, help me to embrace the power and grace of your purposes that Joseph's life teaches me. So, again, we're trying to let this story become part of who we are. Trying to fully embrace it, not just as a piece of history, but as a story that we can use to motivate us and to realize, yes, wounds come. God is using them to transform us. Thank you all.